The moment the pen touched the paper, Lauren Whitmore laughed out loud, right in front of the judge. "That's it," she said, staring at the husband of 11 years like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong building. "No fight over the house. You're just going to sign and walk away with nothing." Caleb Whitmore didn't answer. He simply finished writing his name. What Lauren didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the man she was mocking could have bought the entire courthouse in cash and still had money left for the parking lot. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We're only just getting started. Caleb Whitmore had signed a lot of things in his life. Work orders, repair estimates, a mortgage he'd paid off 2 years early just so he could sleep better at night. But nothing had ever felt like this, a single sheet of paper that ended 11 years in about 4 seconds, and all it needed was his name. He picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. That was the part that surprised him most. Across the table, Lauren watched him with an expression she probably thought looked like pity. It didn't. It looked like triumph wearing pity's clothes, and Caleb had gotten very good over the years at telling the two apart. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I actually expected you to make this difficult. I had Diane draft 3 separate contingency filings in case you tried to go after the house or my 401k or..." She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "God! Caleb, you didn't even ask for the truck payments back. The one I bought you. Do you understand what you're walking away from?" "I understand exactly what I'm walking away from," Caleb said quietly. "Do you?" Lauren tilted her head. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man who finally accepted that he was never going to be able to keep up. That's not weakness, Caleb. I actually mean that. It's realistic. You did the smart thing." The judge, a heavy-set man named Judge Harmon, who had clearly seen 1,000 versions of this exact conversation, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, if we could keep the proceedings..." "I'm sorry, Your Honor." Lauren didn't sound sorry. She sounded like a woman who had waited a long time to say something and wasn't quite finished. "It's just 11 years, and it ends with him signing away everything without a single word of protest. I think I'm allowed a moment." Caleb set the pen down. He looked at her, really looked at her the way he used to look at her when they were 24, and she still laughed at his jokes instead of measuring them against some invisible scale of who was doing better in life. "You want a protest?" he said. "I'm not going to give you one. Not because I don't have anything to say, Lauren, because none of it matters to you. It never has." Something flickered across her face, not quite hurt, not quite anger. Recognition, maybe. Like she knew he was right and hated that he'd said it out loud in front of her attorney and the court reporter and the judge who was now very deliberately looking at his own hands. "There's one thing I want," Caleb said. "Just one." "The truck," Lauren said flatly. "Fine, take the truck." "Noah." The word landed in the room like a dropped wrench. Lauren's attorney, a sharp, quick woman named Diane Prescott, who had been silent up to that point, sat forward so fast, her chair squeaked against the floor. Mr. Whitmore custody arrangements are not decided through informal declarations during a property settlement hearing. There is a separate... "I know how the process works," Caleb said, still looking at Lauren. "I'm not filing anything today. I'm telling you what I want. There's a difference." Lauren's laugh this time was smaller, more brittle. "You want primary custody. You. A man who works 6 days a week with grease under his fingernails, who doesn't have a retirement account that isn't a joke, who, Caleb, I make more in 4 months than you make in a year. What exactly are you offering him that I can't?" "Time," Caleb said. "Time." She repeated the word like it tasted strange in her mouth. "You think that's a defense in family court? I have time. Judges don't hand children to the parent with more free hours. Caleb, they hand children to the parent who can provide stability." "Then we'll let a judge decide that," Caleb said. "Not you, not today." Judge Harmon, sensing the temperature in the room climbing past what a Tuesday afternoon property hearing was built to handle, tapped his pen against the folder in front of him. "Let's stay focused on the matter before us. Mr. Whitmore, You've indicated your waiving claim to the marital home, the joint investment accounts, and half of Mrs. Whitmore's retirement contributions accrued during the marriage. Is that correct? That's correct, Your Honor. And you understand that this waiver is final. You will not be able to revisit these terms at a later date. I understand. Lauren's attorney was watching Caleb now with a different kind of attention. The kind that came from 20 years of reading people across negotiating tables and sensing when something didn't add up. She'd seen desperate men before. She'd seen broken men, exhausted men, men who signed away everything because they just wanted the fighting to stop. Caleb didn't look like any of them. He looked like a man doing math in his head and coming up with an answer he was completely at peace with. She didn't say anything, not yet. But she made a note on her legal pad. Small and private, the kind of note lawyers make when something feels off and they don't yet know why. Now, 2 hours earlier in the hallway outside the courtroom, Margaret Ellis had grabbed Caleb's arm hard enough to stop him mid-stride. Margaret had been the Whitmore family's attorney for almost 30 years. She'd drafted Walter Whitmore's will. She'd sat across from a 12-year-old Caleb at his father's kitchen table and explained in the gentlest language a lawyer could manage what a trust fund was and why his father had built one so quietly that not even his own son had known about it until he was 26 years old, and sitting in this same firm's conference room, staring at a number that didn't seem like it belonged to his life. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said low enough that no one else in the hallway could hear. "You could walk in there right now and end this in an afternoon. Full custody, more than fair alimony terms, a settlement that would make Diane Prescott's eyes water. You have the leverage, Caleb. You've had it this whole time." "I know what I have." "Then use it." Caleb shook his head slowly. "The second I use it, this stops being about Noah. It becomes about money. About who has more, who deserves more, who's punishing who. I've watched what money does to people, Margaret. I watched it happen to my own father's business partners. I'm not going to let it happen to my son's childhood." "She's going to walk in there and humiliate you," Margaret said. "You know that, right? She's going to stand in front of a judge and call you a failure. She's going to say it in front of witnesses on the record, and you are going to have to sit there and take it." "I know." "And that doesn't bother you?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Somewhere down the hallway, a bailiff's radio crackled with static and went silent again. "It bothers me," he admitted. "But you know what bothers me more? The idea of Noah growing up watching his parents tear each other apart over a house neither of us needs. He's 8 years old, Margaret. He doesn't know what a settlement is. He knows his mom and dad aren't living together anymore, and he needs at least one of us to walk through this like it's not the end of the world. I can't control what Lauren does in there. I can control what I do." Margaret studied him for a long moment, the way she used to study his father across that same kind of quiet, stubborn silence, back when Walter Whitmore had made decisions nobody else understood, and never once explained himself until it was far too late for anyone to argue. "You are so much like him, it's frightening," she said finally. "Is that a compliment? Ask me again in 20 years. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase. "For what it's worth, I still think you're wrong not to use what you have. But I've never once seen you make a decision I didn't eventually understand. So, let's go sign your name to a very expensive piece of paper." To understand why Caleb Whitmore was capable of sitting in a courtroom and letting a woman he used to love call him a failure without so much as raising his voice, you had to go back. Not just to the wedding or the day Noah was born, or even to the funeral that changed everything. You had to go back to a kitchen table in a small house on the edge of town where a boy of 12 sat across from his father and asked a question that would end up shaping the rest of his life. "Dad," young Caleb had said, "why don't we have a nicer house? Tommy Ferris said his dad drives a Cadillac." Walter Whitmore had set down his coffee mug slowly, the way he did when he was about to say something he wanted his son to actually remember. "You want to know something about money, Caleb," he'd said. "It's the easiest thing in the world to get people to respect you for. And it's the hardest thing in the world to get people to respect you despite. I'd rather you learn how to earn the second kind." Caleb hadn't understood it then. He was 12. He wanted a bike with gears that worked and shoes that didn't have his older cousin's name written in permanent marker on the tongue. But the sentence stayed with him, the way certain sentences do, buried somewhere quiet until the day life needed it. Walter Whitmore had built something enormous without anyone in town ever quite realizing it. What had started as a single hangar and 2 aging cargo planes in the 1980s had grown slowly and deliberately into a private network of aviation logistics companies, commercial leasing operations, and long-term investment holdings that by the time Walter died were worth well over $200 million. And almost nobody knew because Walter Whitmore had spent 40 years driving the same beat-up Ford and eating lunch at the same diner counter and telling anyone who asked that he did a little work with planes. He'd raised Caleb the same way. No private schools, no trust fund conversations at the dinner table. Just work, real work, hands in the engine work, because Walter believed with a conviction that bordered on religious, that a man who never learned to build something with his own hands would never understand the value of anything he was later handed. So Caleb grew up fixing lawnmowers for neighbors at 14. Working weekends at Denny Ruiz's garage at 16. By the time he was 22, he had his own small mechanic shop on Route 93, employees a waiting list of regulars who trusted him with their cars, the way people trust a family doctor, and absolutely no idea that his father was quietly worth more than most of the companies in the state. He found out the day after the funeral. Margaret Ellis had sat him down in the conference room, still in his black suit, still smelling faintly of the funeral home's carnations, and slid a folder across the table. "Before you say anything," she'd said, "I need you to understand this is real. This isn't a formality. This is your father's entire life's work, and as of yesterday, it's yours." Caleb had opened the folder and stared at a number that didn't fit into any part of his life. $206 million. Aviation holdings. Real estate portfolios spread across 4 states. A trust structured so cleanly, so deliberately invisible, that not one bank teller or business partner in Caleb's adult life had ever had reason to suspect the mechanic on Route 9 was sitting on a fortune. "Why didn't he tell me?" Caleb had asked, and his voice had cracked in a way it hadn't since he was a teenager. "He told me once," Margaret said. "About 15 years ago. He said, 'I don't want Caleb to grow up knowing he has a safety net so big he never has to learn to fall. He wanted you to become a man first. Then if you ever needed it, really needed it, it would be there.'" Caleb had sat in that conference room for almost an hour without saying a word, turning the folder over in his hands like it might tell him something his father never had the chance to. And then he'd made a decision that Margaret Ellis would later describe as the single most Walter Whitmore thing she had ever seen someone do who wasn't actually Walter Whitmore. He kept the mechanic shop open. He didn't touch a single dollar of the inheritance beyond what was legally required to maintain the trust. He let it sit growing quietly under professional management while he kept showing up to work at 6 in the morning in the same coveralls, kept eating lunch out of the same cooler, kept living in the same rented house he'd had since he was 23. 3 years later, he met Lauren. She'd come into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon with a check engine light and an attitude that made it very clear she thought mechanics were a necessary inconvenience like dentists or the DMV. "How long is this going to take?" she'd asked, not looking up from her phone. "Depends what I find," Caleb had said. "Give me 20 minutes. She'd looked up, then actually looked at him, and something in her expression shifted the way it does when a person expects one thing and gets handed something entirely different. Caleb was 29 at the time, wiping his hands on a shop rag dirt under his nails, completely unbothered by the fact that a woman in a $2,000 blazer was standing in his garage looking at him like he was an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted for. "You're staring," he'd said, not unkindly. "I'm not staring. I'm waiting." "You're staring." She'd almost smiled. Almost. 20 minutes later, he told her it was a faulty sensor, a 15-minute fix, $40, including the part. She'd stared at the bill like it was written in a foreign language. "That's it, $40. You were expecting more." I was expecting you to find 6 other things wrong with it. That's what mechanics do. Not this one, Caleb had said. Lauren Hastings. She hadn't been a Whitmore yet, had come back to that shop 4 more times over the next 2 months, with problems that, in hindsight, her car had never actually had. By the 5th visit, Caleb had stopped pretending not to notice. "There's nothing wrong with your car," he'd said, arms crossed, trying not to smile. "I know," she'd admitted. "So why do you keep bringing it in?" "Because you're the only person I've met in 2 years who doesn't ask what I do for a living within the first 5 minutes of meeting me." That had been the beginning. 2 people from entirely different worlds. Lauren climbing fast through a regional consulting firm, sharp-elbowed and hungry, in a way that Caleb found both magnetic and, if he was honest with himself, even then a little unsettling. And Caleb, worth more money than she would earn in 10 lifetimes, telling her nothing except that he fixed cars for a living and liked it that way. She never asked why a mechanic seemed so unbothered by everything. She assumed contentment. She never once suspected it might be something else entirely. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony that Lauren's mother complained was modest, in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. Noah was born 2 years after that, and for a while, a real while, not a performed one, Caleb had believed they were building something that would last. He remembered the night Noah was born with a clarity that outlasted almost every other memory from that period of his life. Lauren exhausted, sweating, gripping his hand so hard it went numb, and then that sound, that first furious, indignant cry, and Caleb had felt something shift inside his chest that he'd never fully be able to explain to anyone, not even Margaret, not even himself. "He's perfect," Lauren had whispered, and for just a moment, exhausted and stripped of every ambition and every calculation, she'd looked at Caleb the way she had in the garage all those years ago. Like he was enough. Like enough was even a category that applied to him. That version of Lauren didn't last as long as Caleb had hoped. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They appeared the way cracks in an engine block usually do, slow, invisible building pressure somewhere out of sight, until one day something simply gives. It started with small comments. Little observations dressed up as jokes. "You know, Rebecca's husband just made partner," Lauren said one evening, scrolling through her phone at the kitchen table while Caleb made dinner. "3rd year in a row he's hit his numbers. They're looking at a place in Cedar Hills." "That's great for them," Caleb said, stirring the pot. "I'm just saying, it's nice when both people in a marriage are growing in the same direction." Caleb hadn't responded to that one. He'd let it pass the way he let most of them pass, telling himself it was tiredness talking, or stress from her promotion, or the particular exhaustion that came from being 3 months into new motherhood and still trying to run a department. But the comments kept coming. At dinner parties with her colleagues, when someone asked what Caleb did, and he said simply, "I run a mechanic shop," he began to notice the half-second pause before Lauren jumped in to add something. "He's actually incredibly good with his hands. He does all the maintenance on the fleet vehicles for 3 different companies. He's basically running a small business, as if the plain truth needed dressing up before it could be presented in that room." "You don't have to do that," he told her once in the car on the way home from one of those parties. "Do what? Explain me, like I'm I don't know. Like I'm something you need to justify." Lauren had been quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. "I'm not embarrassed of you, Caleb." "I didn't say you were." "I just want people to see what I see. That's all." He'd wanted to believe her. For a long time he did. Noah grew up fast, the way kids do when you're not paying close enough attention, and somewhere in the blur of a first day of kindergarten, a broken arm at the playground, 100 small, ordinary days, Caleb became the parent who was always there. Not because Lauren didn't love their son. She did fiercely, in the particular way she loved everything, with intensity, with ambition, with a determination to give him every advantage she believed her own upbringing had lacked. But her love came in bursts, scheduled around board meetings and client dinners, and the 18-hour days that came with being one of the youngest VPs the firm had ever promoted. Caleb's love came in the ordinary hours. The 6 a.m. breakfasts, The homework at the kitchen table, the bedtime stories that had to be told in a specific order, or Noah would notice and demand a restart. The nights Noah woke up scared of a noise in his closet, and it was Caleb, not Lauren, who sat on the edge of the bed until his breathing slowed. "Daddy," Noah had said once, maybe 5 years old, sleepy and half serious in the way small children are when they say the truest things. "You always come when I call. Mommy comes when she's not busy." Caleb hadn't known what to say to that. He'd just pulled the blanket up over his son's shoulders and sat there a while longer than he needed to. By the time Noah turned 7, the marriage had settled into something Caleb recognized but couldn't name. For a long time, not open hostility, nothing dramatic, just a kind of quiet erosion. Lauren had been promoted again this time to a position that came with a corner office and a title that made her mother finally stop asking when she was going to do something more with her business degree. She started traveling more. She started coming home later. And she started looking at Caleb at the shop, the coveralls, the same rented house they'd never upgraded from, because Caleb had never seen a reason to, with an expression that had slowly curdled from affection into something closer to disappointment. "I don't understand you sometimes," she told him one night, not unkindly, just tired. "You're smart, you're capable. You could run a real business, a chain, a franchise, something. Instead, you're still under a car with a wrench in your hand at 41 years old like it's still 1990. "I like what I do, Lauren." "I know you like it. That's not the point." Then what is the point? She hadn't had an answer for that. Or she had one, and didn't want to say it out loud because saying it out loud would have made it real. That somewhere along the way she had started measuring her husband against a scale he had never agreed to be measured on, and he was coming up short every single time, and it was eating away at something between them that neither of them knew how to name. Caleb never told her about the money. Not once, not even in the moments when it might have made things easier, when she came home frustrated about a colleague's bonus, when she sighed over a mortgage statement, when she looked at him with that particular disappointment, and he could have, with a single sentence, changed the entire architecture of how she saw him. He thought about it. God, he thought about it more times than he ever admitted to anyone, even Margaret. But every time the words got close to his mouth, his father's voice came back to him steady and certain across a kitchen table. 20 years gone. I don't want you to grow up knowing you have a safety net so big you never have to learn to fall. Caleb had learned to fall a long time ago. What he was afraid of, what kept the words locked behind his teeth every single time, was what would happen to Lauren's love for him if she ever found out it had a price tag attached the whole time. He didn't want to know if she would have stayed for him or for the number. And as long as he never told her, he never had to find out. It was, he would later admit to Margaret, probably the loneliest decision he ever made. And also somehow the only one that let him sleep at night. The unraveling, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. There was no affair, no screaming match, no single moment either of them could point to later and say that was when it broke. It was simply a Tuesday evening in March when Lauren came home from a work trip, sat down across from Caleb at the kitchen table, where Noah wasn't yet home from a friend's house, and said in the calm, decisive tone she used for closing business deals, "I think we need to end this." Caleb had set down his fork. "End what exactly?" "This, us. I've thought about it for a long time, Caleb. I don't think either of us is happy. I don't think we've been happy in years, if we're being honest with each other." "That's not entirely true," Caleb said quietly. "I've been happy with our son. I've been happy in this house, in this life we built." "I don't know that you have." Lauren didn't argue with that. That, more than anything, was the moment Caleb understood it was really over. Because if she'd disagreed, if she'd fought him on it, some small part of him might have believed there was still something worth fighting for. Instead, she just looked at him with an expression that was almost gentle, almost sad, and said, "I think you deserve someone who's actually satisfied with the life you want to live. And I think I need to stop pretending I am." "So this is about me not being enough," Caleb said, not angry, just tired. "It's about neither of us being who the other one needs," Lauren said. "That's not the same as blame." But it felt like blame. It felt exactly like blame, dressed up in the softest language Lauren's corporate training could produce, and Caleb sat there in the kitchen of the house he'd never upgraded across from the woman he'd loved for 13 years, and understood with total clarity that she had already made peace with the ending, long before she said a word of it out loud. Noah, he said finally. What happens to Noah? And that was the question that would define the next 4 months of both their lives. The question that would eventually walk them both into a courtroom, into a hallway conversation with Margaret Ellis, into a moment where Lauren Whitmore would laugh out loud at the sight of her husband signing away a fortune she didn't know existed, certain right up until the very end that she already knew exactly who Caleb Whitmore was. She had no idea how wrong she was. The night before the hearing, Caleb sat on the edge of Noah's bed in the small rented house that would in a matter of months become his alone. Noah was 8 years old and had that particular look children get when they've overheard far more than the adults around them. Realize quiet, watchful, working something over in his mind before he trusts himself to say it out loud. "Dad," Noah said, finally staring up at the ceiling instead of at his father. "Tomorrow's the court thing, right?" "That's right, bud." "Is that where they decide who I live with?" Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, the way it always did whenever his son said something too old for his age. Something that proved he'd been paying attention the whole time, even when the adults thought they were being careful. "Not tomorrow," Caleb said gently. "Tomorrow's a different part, but yeah, eventually a judge is going to help figure out the schedule, where you sleep on which nights, that kind of thing. What if they pick Mom? Then you'll live with your mom some of the time, and I'll still see you every single week, I promise you that." "What if they pick you?" "Same thing, just the other way around. Either way, Noah, I'm not going anywhere. That part isn't up for a vote." Noah was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Mom said you don't have as much money as her. She wasn't being mean, she said it like it's a fact, like it's the reason things are different now." Caleb chose his next words carefully, the way he chose the torque on a bolt that mattered firm enough to hold careful enough not to strip the threads. "Money's not why your mom and I aren't together anymore, bud. That's grown-up stuff, and none of it is because of anything you did, and none of it is really about money either, no matter what it might look like from the outside. But you don't have a lot of it. Money, I mean." "I have enough," Caleb said, which was in its own careful way the first true thing he'd ever said to his son that came anywhere close to the whole truth. "And even if I didn't, Noah, look at me. Even if I had nothing, not $1 that wouldn't change how much I love you. That's not the kind of thing money buys or takes away." Noah finally turned his head on the pillow to look at him. "Promise." "I promise." "Okay." Noah exhaled some small weight, visibly lifting off his narrow shoulders, the particular relief of a child who has been carrying a worry alone for longer than any adult realized. "Can you do the voices for the last chapter? Not the fast reading. The real voices." Caleb picked the book back up off the nightstand throat, tighter than he wanted his son to notice. "The real voices," he agreed. "Every one of them." He stayed until Noah's breathing evened out into sleep, and then he sat there a while longer in the dark, thinking about a courtroom he'd be standing in. The next morning, a wife who was about to call him a failure in front of a judge, and a small sleeping boy who had just told him without meaning to exactly what was actually at stake. It wasn't the house. It had never been the house. Sorry. Back in the present. In the quiet after the custody statement had landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Judge Harmon shuffled his papers and cleared his throat a second time. "Given the informal nature of that statement, I'm going to note it for the record, but we will need to schedule a separate custody hearing to address it formally. Mrs. Whitmore, your attorney is correct. This isn't the forum for that discussion today." "Understood, Your Honor," Diane Prescott said smoothly, though her eyes stayed fixed on Caleb a beat too long. Lauren, for her part, had recovered her composure. She smoothed the front of her blazer, the same practiced gesture she made before walking into a boardroom, and looked at Caleb with something that had hardened back into certainty. "You can request whatever you want." she said low enough that it was almost just for him. "But you and I both know how this ends, Caleb. I have the house, I have the income, I have stability that a courtroom is going to recognize in about 4 seconds. What exactly do you think you're going to walk in there with?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Somewhere behind his calm, something old and quiet and absolutely certain was standing its ground. "You'll find out," he said. He picked the pen back up, signed the final line of the property settlement, and slid the paper back across the table without another word. Lauren watched him do it, watched the ease in his hands, the total absence of hesitation, and for the briefest second, so brief she'd later convince herself she imagined it. Something in her chest tightened with a feeling she didn't have a name for yet. Not guilt. Not quite doubt. Something closer to the sensation of standing on ground she'd always assumed was solid and feeling just for an instant the smallest possible tremor beneath her feet. She dismissed it. Of course she dismissed it. Because the man across the table was still wearing the same grease-stained work jacket he'd worn into that courtroom, still carrying the same faded mechanic's cap. He sat on the table beside the papers still in every visible way. Exactly the man she had decided somewhere over the last few years that she had outgrown. What Lauren didn't see, what nobody in that room saw, except Margaret Ellis standing quietly by the door with her arms crossed and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, was the man sitting 3 rows back near the exit. A stranger in an expensive suit who had slipped in halfway through the hearing and hadn't taken his eyes off Caleb Whitmore since. His name was Victor Hale, and he had spent the last 6 weeks trying to find out exactly what Walter Whitmore's son was really worth. Today, watching Caleb sign away a house and a savings account without so much as a flicker of hesitation, Victor Hale finally had his answer. And it was worth a great deal more than anyone in that courtroom currently understood. Caleb tucked the folder Margaret handed him under one arm, settled his old cap back on his head, and walked out of the courtroom the same way he'd walked in, unhurried, unbothered, carrying himself like a man who had lost everything. Lauren watched him go, and allowed herself finally a small private smile. She had no idea she was watching the beginning of something, not the end of it. Victor Hale waited until the hallway had mostly emptied before he moved. He didn't approach Caleb. He didn't approach Margaret. He simply stood near the elevator bank with his phone pressed to his ear, watching the mechanic in the faded work jacket walk out through the courthouse doors like a man with absolutely nowhere important to be, and dialed a number he'd been saving for exactly this moment. "It's me," he said once the line connected. "I need everything you can find on a private aviation holding company out of the Tri-County area. Whitmore Aviation Group or something close to that name. Look at filings going back 30 years. And I want to know who's listed as beneficiary on the trust quietly, no paper trail back to me." He listened for a moment, watching through the glass doors as Caleb climbed into an old pickup truck in the parking lot. "No," Hale said. "I don't think he's broke. I think he's the best-kept secret in this entire state, and I intend to be the man who finds him first." He hung up before anyone could ask him what he meant by that. Caleb, for his part, had no idea any of it was happening. He drove home with the windows cracked, one hand on the wheel, thinking about nothing more complicated than what to make Noah for dinner and whether the transmission fluid he'd ordered for the shop had come in yet. The hearing was behind him. The house was gone, the joint accounts were gone, and none of it weighed on him the way he suspected it was supposed to. What weighed on him was the custody hearing still ahead, the real fight, the only one that mattered, and he spent the whole drive turning over again and again what he was going to say to a judge who had never met his son and would somehow be asked to decide who Noah belonged with. He picked Noah up from his mother's sister's house where he'd been dropped for the afternoon, and the boy ran to the truck with the particular unguarded joy that 8-year-olds hadn't yet learned to hide. "Did you win?" Noah asked, climbing into the passenger seat. "It wasn't that kind of court thing, bud. Aunt Carol said you were settling the divorce." "What's settling mean?" Caleb pulled out of the driveway, choosing his words the way he always did around his son, honest but careful. "It means your mom and I finished dividing up the things we used to share. The house. The money in the bank." "Did you get the house?" "No, your mom's keeping the house." Noah frowned out the window, working through the math of it, the way kids do, matching outcomes to fairness, in a way adults had long since trained themselves out of. That doesn't seem fair. You paid for it too. Some things aren't about fair, bud. They're about what matters most. And what matters most to me isn't a house. Caleb glanced over at him. It's you. That's the only thing I asked for today. Noah didn't say anything right away, but Caleb saw something in his shoulders loosen the same way it had the night before, like a boy slowly setting down a weight he'd been carrying without telling anyone. Across town, in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building Caleb had driven past 1,000 times without ever once feeling the need to go inside, Lauren Whitmore was having a very different kind of conversation. He's not going to get custody, Diane Prescott said, sliding a folder across her desk. I want to be clear about that before we go one step further. A judge is not going to hand primary custody of an 8-year-old to a man whose entire financial picture is a small business loan and a checking account with 4 figures in it. That's not how family court works, Lauren, no matter how touching his little speech was this morning. He surprised me, Lauren admitted. I've never heard him talk like that. About Noah's routines. The bedtime stories. I didn't even know he knew all of that. Of course he knows it. He's around more than you are statistically. Diane said it without malice, the flat delivery of a woman who dealt in facts because feelings didn't win cases. That's not nothing, and I'm not going to pretend the evaluator won't notice it. But presence isn't the only factor a court weighs. Stability is. Resources are. Educational opportunity is. And on every one of those, you're going to outscore him by a mile. Lauren nodded slowly, but something in her chest hadn't fully settled since the hearing, and she couldn't quite name why. She kept replaying the moment Caleb had signed the papers, the absolute absence of panic in his hands, the calm in his voice when he'd told her you'll find out. She'd built a version of Caleb in her head over the last several years, a version defined by what he lacked, and for one uncomfortable second in that courtroom, that version hadn't fit the man sitting across from her. There's something else, Lauren said. It's probably nothing. Tell me anyway. I don't like surprises in a case I'm supposed to be winning. His father, Walter, died a few years ago. Caleb never talked about it much, but I remember at the funeral there were people there I didn't recognize. Businessmen, not garage customers. Men in suits who all seemed to know each other and none of them seemed to know me. Diane's pen paused over her legal pad. Did you ever ask him about it? I asked once. He said his dad did a little work with planes. I let it go. Caleb's private about his family. I always figured it was a grief thing. Lauren shook her head, waving the thought away like smoke. It's probably nothing. I'm grasping because he rattled me in there, and I don't like being rattled. Well, if it makes you feel better, I'll have someone pull a basic asset search, Diane said. Standard practice in any custody dispute anyway. If there's anything material, we'll know before the evaluation is finished. If there isn't, you can stop thinking about it and focus on what actually matters, showing the court that Noah's life is better with you as his primary caregiver. Lauren nodded, but the unease didn't fully leave her. Not that day, and not for several days after sitting somewhere in the back of her mind like a stone in a shoe she couldn't quite locate. 3 days later, Margaret Ellis showed up at Caleb's shop without calling first, which in itself was enough to make Caleb set down the wrench he was holding and wipe his hands before she'd even gotten out of her car. You don't drive over here unless something's wrong, Caleb said. I drive over here because I like watching you work with your hands, and remembering that you could buy this entire strip mall and everyone in it. Margaret said. But yes, something's wrong. Or at least, something's moving faster than I'd like. Talk to me. There's a man named Victor Hale. He runs a private acquisitions firm, mostly aviation and logistics assets, which means, unfortunately, he runs in exactly the kind of circles where your father's old business partners still talk to each other. 2 of them mentioned to a mutual contact of mine that Hale's been asking questions. About the Whitmore Trust. About who controls it now. Margaret crossed her arms. About you. Caleb felt something in his stomach tighten quiet and cold, the way it used to when a customer's brakes came back from an inspection worse than he'd hoped. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he already suspects the truth and just wants confirmation. Caleb men like Victor Hale don't chase rumors for fun. They chase them because there's usually money at the end, and they're very good at figuring out how to insert themselves into a situation before anyone else even knows there's an opportunity. An opportunity for what? I don't know yet. Could be he wants a piece of the aviation holdings buy-in before anyone realizes what they're worth. Could be something uglier. Men like that have been known to use information as leverage instead of buying it outright, especially when there's a public court proceeding already underway that could make a person very motivated to keep certain facts quiet. Margaret's voice softened slightly. I need you to hear me on this. You are in the middle of a custody fight. If Victor Hale finds a way to make this public on his own terms before you're ready, you lose control of the story, and you especially lose control of how Lauren finds out. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, looking past Margaret toward the open bay of the shop, where his youngest employee, a 20-year-old named Danny, who Caleb had personally taught to rebuild a transmission, was laughing at something on his phone, completely unaware that the man he worked for could have bought the building out from under all of them without blinking. How much time do we have? Caleb asked. Honestly, I don't know. Weeks, maybe? Less if he moves fast, and men like Hale usually move fast. Margaret studied him. There's also the discovery process to think about. Diane Prescott is sharp, and even without Hale sniffing around, standard custody proceedings often come with financial disclosure requirements, especially if either party's stability becomes a contested issue. If Lauren's team requests a full asset review as part of proving you can or can't provide a stable home, and they will, Caleb, because that's exactly the argument they're planning to make, you may not get to choose the moment this comes out. It may simply be required. So there's no scenario where I keep this quiet through the whole case. There might have been once. I don't think there is anymore. Margaret's expression, usually so composed, carried something almost apologetic. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Caleb nodded slowly, absorbing it the way he absorbed most difficult news quietly without drama, already turning the problem over to look for the angle that mattered. Then we don't let Victor Hale or a subpoena decide when it comes out. We decide, on our terms in a way that protects Noah. That's the right instinct, Margaret said. I'll start preparing the disclosure paperwork so we're ready to move the second we need to. In the meantime, watch yourself. If Hale approaches you directly, and I suspect he will, don't engage, call me first. She left 20 minutes later, and Caleb stood in the bay of his shop for a long while after her car pulled out of the lot, the wrench still sitting untouched on the workbench where he'd left it. He didn't have to wait long for Hale to make his move. 4 days later, a man in an expensive gray suit walked into the shop just before closing, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life worried about whether he belonged in a room. You must be Caleb, the man said, extending a hand. Victor Hale. I've got a fleet of company vehicles that need regular servicing, and I've heard good things about this place. Caleb shook the hand, keeping his expression easy, unreadable. Word of mouth's been good to us. What kind of fleet are we talking about? 12 vehicles, give or take. Logistics company. We move a lot of freight, which means a lot of wear and tear. Hale glanced around the shop with the practiced eye of a man assessing value, even when he was pretending not to. Nice operation you've got here. Family business. Started it myself. Interesting. I heard you came from an aviation family. Whitmore, that name mean anything around here? I could swear I've seen it on some old hangar paperwork out near the county airfield. There it was. Caleb felt the question land exactly where it was meant to, a hook baited to see what would bite. He kept his voice flat, unbothered, the same voice he used when a customer tried to talk him down on a fair price. Common enough name, Caleb said. There's a few Whitmores around. Sure. Hale smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. Well, I'll have my office call about the fleet contract. In the meantime, he pulled a card from his jacket and set it on the counter. Deliberate, unhurried. If you ever want to talk about anything else. Aviation holdings, old family trusts, that sort of thing. I've got a lot of experience helping people figure out what quiet assets are actually worth. No pressure. Just keep the card. He walked out without waiting for a response, and Caleb stood at the counter for a long moment, staring at the card, understanding with total clarity that Margaret's warning had not been an exaggeration. He called her from the shop phone before Hale's car had even pulled out of the lot. "He came in," Caleb said. "Fishing. Mentioned the airfield, mentioned the Whitmore name directly. Left a card and a not-so-subtle offer to help me figure out what my quiet assets are worth." Margaret exhaled slowly on the other end. "Okay, that confirms what I was hearing. He knows, or he's close enough to knowing, that it doesn't matter. We need to move faster than I'd hoped." "Move how?" "I want to start the custody evaluation process immediately before Hale finds a way to insert himself into it, and before Diane Prescott's discovery request forces our hand on someone else's timeline. If the truth is coming out no matter what, I'd rather it come out through a proper legal disclosure that we control in a courtroom in front of a judge who has to weigh it fairly, not through a leak to a tabloid, or a call from Victor Hale to your soon-to-be ex-wife designed to cause maximum damage." "Understood," Caleb said. "Do what you need to do." The custody evaluation began the following week, and it was for Caleb the first time in the entire process that he actually felt something close to hope. The evaluator was a woman named Patricia Reyes, sharp-eyed and unhurried, the kind of person who had clearly spent 2 decades learning to read rooms and children in equal measure. She showed up at Caleb's house on a Wednesday afternoon with a clipboard and an expression that gave nothing away. And Caleb, despite Margaret's advice to relax, felt his pulse pick up the moment her car pulled into the driveway. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, shaking his hand. "I'll be observing mostly. Try to go about your normal routine. I'm not here to catch you doing anything wrong. I'm here to see what your normal actually looks like." "That's all I've got to offer," Caleb said. "Normal." He made dinner while she watched. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti, the same recipe he'd been making since Noah was old enough to eat solid food, and Noah set the table without being asked, chattering the entire time about a science project involving a volcano that had, in his words, kind of worked, but mostly just smelled bad. "Does your dad help you with homework?" Reyes asked at one point, her tone easy conversational. "Every night," Noah said. "Except Fridays, because Fridays we don't do homework, we watch a movie instead. That's the rule." "Whose rule is that?" "Ours," Noah said like it was obvious. "Me and Dad made it up together." Reyes made a note, small and unhurried, and Caleb, watching from across the kitchen, felt something in his chest ease for the first time in weeks. Later, after Noah had gone to bed, Reyes sat with Caleb at the kitchen table and asked the harder questions about his work schedule, his support system, his plans for Noah's care if he ever had to travel, his understanding of Noah's school performance, his friends, his fears. "He mentioned a science project," Caleb said when she asked about school. "He's better at math than reading, but he doesn't like admitting it because his friend Marcus is the best reader in the class and Noah hates coming in second at anything. His teacher's name is Mrs. Alvarez. He's got a loose tooth he's been wiggling for 2 weeks and refusing to let me pull. He sleeps with the hallway light on, but only halfway open because full dark makes him think about a dream he had last year, and full light makes it hard to fall asleep." Caleb paused. "I could keep going if that's useful." Reyes looked up from her clipboard, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something like genuine warmth crossed her face. "That's useful," she said quietly. "That's very useful, Mr. Whitmore." The visit to Lauren's house 2 days later went differently. Not badly exactly, but differently in ways that Reyes would later note with the same careful, unbiased precision she brought to everything. Lauren had cleared her schedule for the afternoon, had the house immaculate, had prepared what was, by any reasonable measure, a beautiful dinner. But when Reyes asked Noah in a quiet moment alone what a normal Tuesday looked like at his mom's house, the boy had shrugged in a way that carried more information than any answer could have. "Depends," Noah said. "Sometimes Mom's home for dinner. Sometimes Ms. Patterson picks me up and Mom gets home after I'm already asleep. She always checks on me, though. I can tell 'cause my blanket's different in the morning." "Do you like staying with your mom?" "Yeah," Noah said without hesitation, and Reyes noted that too, the immediate, uncomplicated loyalty of a child who loved both his parents without needing either of them to be perfect. I know her schedule less. Like I don't always know if she's gonna be there. With Dad, I always know. Lauren, watching from the doorway without quite meaning to overhear, felt something crack quietly in her chest that she wasn't prepared for, and she said nothing about it that night. Not to Reyes, not to Diane Prescott, not even really to herself. She simply filed it away in the same place she'd been filing every small, uncomfortable realization since the hearing, a growing pile of things she wasn't ready to look at directly. That weekend, without telling anyone where she was going, not even Diane, Lauren drove 40 minutes out past the edge of town to the county airfield following a half-memory from Walter Whitmore's funeral of a hanger, with a faded sign she'd never once bothered to read closely. She told herself she was just curious. She told herself it didn't mean anything, but she parked the car at the edge of a gravel lot and sat there for a full minute before she found the nerve to get out. The hangar was smaller than she'd expected and quieter, a single long building with a corrugated roof and a chain-link fence around a stretch of tarmac where two aging cargo planes sat under tarps. An older man in a faded jumpsuit was working near the open bay door, and he looked up when her heels crunched against the gravel, squinting at her like he was trying to place her face against some memory of his own. "Help you with something?" he asked. "I'm sorry to bother you. I used to be married to Caleb Whitmore, Walter's son." Something shifted in the old man's expression immediately, a kind of careful recalculation. "You're Lauren," he said. It wasn't a question. "Walter mentioned you a few times years back. I worked maintenance for the company for almost 30 years, Ray Delgado." He extended a grease-stained hand, and she shook it, feeling suddenly foolish in her blazer and heels against the backdrop of rusted steel and cracked tarmac. "I didn't realize this place was still operating," Lauren said. "Barely. Most of the active fleets leased out now managed through the holding company. This hangar's mostly storage and legacy contracts these days." Ray studied her for a moment. "You didn't know that either, did you?" "Know what?" "That there's a holding company." Ray shook his head slowly, not unkindly, more like a man watching a puzzle click into a shape he'd expected all along. "Walter built something real out here, Mrs. Whitmore. Real. I don't know how much of it made it down to Caleb, or how much Caleb ever wanted, God rest him. That boy never once acted like he wanted a dime of it. But this place, the leasing contracts, the properties over in 3 counties, that's not pocket change. That's not a man who did a little work with planes." Lauren felt something go very still and very cold in her chest. "How much are we talking about, Ray?" The old man held up both hands, taking a careful step back. "That's not my business to say, ma'am. And honestly, it's not really mine to know exactly either. I just turned wrenches and kept the birds in the air. But I'll tell you this much for free, whatever number's in your head right now, you're probably underselling it. Walter Whitmore didn't do anything small. He just did it quiet." Lauren thanked him, her voice steadier than she felt, and walked back to her car, with her mind racing faster than it had in years, faster than the day she'd been offered the VP position, faster than the day Noah was born. She sat behind the wheel for a long time before she turned the key, staring at the faded hangar sign through the windshield, running back through 11 years of memory with a completely different lens, now searching for all the moments she'd missed, or worse, all the moments she'd seen clearly and simply, chosen not to understand. The strangers in dark suits at the funeral. The way Caleb had never once flinched at a medical bill, a car repair, a bad month at the shop. The calm, that infuriating, unshakable calm that she'd spent years quietly resenting as a kind of failure to care about their future, when it might have been the whole time something closer to certainty. She didn't call Diane that night. She didn't call anyone. She drove home in silence and sat in her driveway for another 20 minutes before she found the will to go inside. And when she finally did, she stood in the kitchen of the house she'd fought so hard to keep, and felt for the first time since the divorce began, genuinely unsure of anything at all. It was Diane who called her back into the office 2 weeks later, sliding a formal document across her desk with the brisk efficiency of a woman who saw it as routine, though for Lauren sitting across from her. Now, Nothing about any of this felt routine anymore. "Standard financial disclosure," Diane said. "We're formally requesting a full accounting of Mr. Whitmore's assets, income, and any trusts or holdings in his name, individually or jointly. Given that we intend to argue financial stability as a factor in the custody determination, the court will expect us to actually establish what his financial picture looks like rather than assume it based on the mechanic's uniform." "You think there's something there?" Lauren said. It wasn't quite a question. "I think there's a small business and probably not much else, and I think establishing that clearly will strengthen our position considerably," Diane said. "But I also think you mentioned an old man in a suit at a funeral once, and I don't like leaving stones unturned. We'll have an answer within 30 days. Courts don't like delays on this kind of thing, and frankly, neither do I." Lauren nodded at Diane, but she didn't wait for the 30 days to run their course. 2 nights later, she drove to Caleb's rented house, without calling first, sitting in her car at the curb for almost as long as she'd sat outside the hangar before she finally made herself walk up the path and knock. Caleb opened the door in a t-shirt with motor oil still on his forearm, and something crossed his face when he saw her. Not alarm exactly, more like a man who had been waiting for a conversation he knew was coming and hadn't quite decided how he felt about it arriving early. "Noah's asleep," he said quietly, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door mostly closed behind him. "What's going on, Lauren?" "I drove out to the airfield," she said. There was no preamble in her, none of the careful corporate softening she usually led with. "Your father's hangar. I talked to a man named Ray. He worked maintenance for the company for 30 years. Caleb didn't say anything. His face didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened the way it did when he was listening very, very carefully. "He said things, Caleb, about a holding company, about properties in 3 counties. He said whatever number I had in my head, I was probably underselling it." Lauren's voice caught just slightly, the first crack in 11 years of careful composure. "Is it true? What exactly do you want me to say? I want you to tell me the truth. For once, after everything." She stepped closer, and in the porch light, Caleb could see how tired she looked, how little sleep the last 2 weeks had actually given her. "Do you have money, Caleb? Real money. The kind that would have changed everything about how we lived, how we fought, how I looked at you every single time I came home exhausted, and you were just calm, unbothered, like none of it touched you." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Margaret's warning about the discovery filing already moving through the courts, about the 30-day clock that was going to answer this question, whether he said a word tonight or not. And he thought about his father sitting across a kitchen table decades ago, telling a 12-year-old boy that money was the easiest thing in the world to get people to respect you for, and the hardest thing in the world to get them to respect you despite. "Yes," he said finally. "I have money, Lauren. More than you're imagining right now, probably. It's been mine since my father died, and I never touched it, and I never told you, and I understand if that's something you can't forgive." Lauren stood very still on the porch, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. 11 years, she said finally, and her voice had gone somewhere flat and strange, somewhere Caleb had never heard it go before. 11 years, Caleb. I stood in front of people at dinner parties and made excuses for you. I told myself I'd married a man who just didn't care about ambition, and I resented you for it quietly for years, and the entire time you were sitting on what, millions, tens of millions. And you let me feel that way. You let me carry that. I know. That's it, you know. What do you want me to say, Lauren? That I'm sorry I am. I'm sorry for the version of this that hurt you. But I'm not sorry I did it. Caleb's voice stayed steady low, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been sitting unspoken for over a decade, finally finding its way out. My father taught me that the second people know what you're worth, they stop seeing you and start seeing the number. I didn't want that for us. I didn't want to spend my whole marriage wondering if you loved the mechanic or the trust fund. So I never gave you the choice to wonder either. That wasn't your decision to make for me. Maybe not, Caleb admitted. But it's the one I made. And for what it's worth, it had nothing to do with not trusting you in the beginning. It had everything to do with what happened after. The comments, Lauren. The way you talked about Rebecca's husband making partner. The way you explained me to your colleagues like I needed defending. If I'd told you the truth 5 years ago, I don't know if any of that stops. I think it just changes what you were disappointed about. Lauren flinched like he'd struck her, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might argue, might deny it outright, the way she used to deny things that were inconvenient and true. Instead, she just stood there, arms wrapped around herself against the cool night air, looking at a man she realized with a kind of vertigo she hadn't felt since she was very young. She had never actually known at all. The discovery filing is going to confirm all of it, she said finally. In 30 days, in front of a judge, in front of Noah's custody evaluator. I know. Why didn't you just tell me tonight, all of it? The number, the company, everything? Because it's not mine to hand you like a peace offering in the middle of a custody fight, Caleb said. It'll come out the way it's supposed to come out, through the disclosure in full, where it can't be twisted into something it isn't. I'm not interested in using it to win an argument with you on your porch at 10 at night. I'm interested in what happens to Noah when a judge finally has the whole picture in front of them. Lauren didn't have an answer for that. She turned and walked back to her car without another word, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the street, feeling for the first time since the papers had been signed the full and undeniable weight of a secret that had finally, after 11 years, started to come apart at the seams. Caleb received Margaret's call about the disclosure request on a Thursday evening, standing in his kitchen with Noah's homework spread across the table and a pot of water just starting to boil on the stove. It's happening, Margaret said. Formal discovery request filed this afternoon. 30-day window. Once this document goes in, Caleb, there's no more controlling the pace. The court is going to have the full picture, and so is Lauren. And so likely is anyone paying close enough attention to public filings, which means Victor Hale as well. Caleb looked over at Noah, bent over a math worksheet at the kitchen table, tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in fierce concentration, utterly unaware that somewhere across town, the last quiet corner of his father's life was about to be pulled into the light for good. 30 days, Caleb repeated. 30 days, Margaret confirmed. I need you to be ready for what happens after that number becomes real to her. Because it's not going to be an accounting document to Lauren Caleb. It's going to be the moment she finds out that everything she believed about the man she was married to for 11 years was wrong. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching his son erase a mistake with careful, focused effort, starting the problem over without complaint, the way Caleb himself had been taught to start over carefully, without drama, until the numbers finally came out right. Let it come out, he said finally. I'm done being afraid of what she'll think when she finally sees the whole picture. I just want her to see it because it's true, Margaret. Not because Victor Hale forced our hand. Understood, Margaret said. I'll have the full disclosure ready before the deadline. In the meantime, keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Which is what? Being his father, Margaret said. That's the only part of this that was ever actually going to matter. Caleb hung up the phone and turned back to the stove, dropping a handful of pasta into the boiling water, and across the kitchen table, Noah looked up from his worksheet, unaware of the 30-day clock that had just quietly started counting down over both their heads. Dad, Noah said, is 7 times 8 54? Close, Caleb said, sitting back down beside him. Try it again. And for the rest of that evening, at least nothing else in the world existed except a math worksheet, a pot of pasta, and a boy who had absolutely no idea how much was about to change. The 30 days passed, the way most hard things do, not all at once, but in small pieces stacked one on top of the other, until the pile became impossible to ignore. Caleb kept the shop open. He kept making breakfast, kept doing homework at the kitchen table, kept the Friday movie rule sacred, even on the night he could barely keep his eyes open through the opening credits. Noah never noticed the tension underneath it, and Caleb made sure of that on purpose, the same careful, deliberate effort he put into every torque spec and every bedtime story, because some things he'd decided a long time ago were simply not allowed to touch his son. Victor Hale did not wait quietly for the disclosure date. 9 days before the hearing, he called Caleb's shop just after closing, and Caleb expecting a customer picked up without checking the number. Caleb Whitmore. Hale said, warm and easy, like they were old friends catching up. I hear congratulations might be in order soon. Word travels fast in certain circles. Financial disclosure custody battle. An ex-wife who just found out her mechanic husband is sitting on 9 figures. That's the kind of story people pay attention to. What do you want, Hale? I want to help you, Hale said. I'm serious. A man in your position, about to become very publicly, very suddenly wealthy in the eyes of the world. You're going to need people who understand how to manage that kind of exposure. Advisors. Structure. Protection, frankly, from people who are going to come out of the woodwork the second that number becomes public. I'd like to be one of the people standing next to you when that happens, instead of one of the people you're worried about. You've been digging around my father's company for weeks, Caleb said. Talking to old business partners, coming into my shop with a fake fleet contract. That's not help, Hale. That's a man circling something he wants a piece of. Hale laughed unbothered, the laugh of a man who had heard no plenty of times and never once let it stick. I won't pretend I don't see an opportunity here. I'd be lying if I did. But opportunities can work both directions, Caleb. I have relationships with people who could make your holding company a great deal more profitable than it currently is. I could also, hypothetically, make sure certain journalists get a very sympathetic version of this story. The quiet millionaire mechanic, the surprised ex-wife, the whole thing before it comes out in a courtroom on someone else's terms. Might be easier for everyone if we talked partnership instead of exposure. Caleb's grip tightened around the phone, but his voice stayed level, the same voice he used on a customer trying to talk him into a repair he didn't need. That sounds like a threat wearing a business suit. It's an offer, Hale said. Threats and offers just sound alike sometimes depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. I'll pass, Caleb said. The disclosure's happening in 9 days through the court exactly the way it's supposed to. Whatever story you were hoping to sell first, you're too late. And Hale, don't call this number again. He hung up before Hale could answer, and stood behind the counter of his shop for a long moment, hands flat on the cold metal, breathing slow and even until the anger in his chest settled back down to something manageable. He called Margaret immediately. He's getting desperate, Margaret said, once Caleb had relayed the conversation. That's actually good news in a strange way. Desperate men make mistakes, and men like Hale don't have any real leverage over you that a judge would ever recognize. He's trying to scare you into a deal because the legitimate path is about to close on him completely. Once the disclosure is filed and public, there's no more information for him to trade. He mentioned journalists. Let him try, Margaret said. A sympathetic exclusive doesn't mean much once the real documents are sitting in a court record for anyone to read. I'd rather the truth come out in a courtroom verified and boring than in a headline written by a man trying to extort you into a partnership. 9 more days, Caleb. Just get through 9 more days. Caleb got through them the only way he knew how, one ordinary evening at a time, one bedtime story at a time, one Friday movie night that Noah, sprawled across the couch with a bowl of popcorn balanced on his stomach, declared, officially the best movie we've watched all year, which made Caleb laugh out loud for what felt like the first time in weeks. The morning of the hearing, Noah stood in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, watching Caleb button his good shirt with the particular seriousness of a child who understood that today was different, even if nobody had explained exactly why. You look nervous, Noah said. I'm not nervous, Caleb said, which wasn't entirely true, and Noah, who had inherited his father's habit of noticing things other people tried to hide, folded his arms and waited him out the way he always did. You keep doing the thing with your jaw, Noah said. The clenching thing. You do it when the transmission on Mr. Palmer's truck doesn't want to come loose. Caleb almost laughed despite himself. Fine. Maybe a little nervous. Is it about the money thing? Noah asked, and Caleb went very still, because they had never once discussed it directly, not in those words, and he'd hoped that whatever Noah understood about the shift in the house lately had stayed vague and unspoken. What do you know about the money thing? I heard you and Miss Ellis talking on the phone one night. I wasn't trying to listen, I heard some of it. About Grandpa's company, about a lot of money. Noah shrugged the small, unbothered shrug of a child who hadn't yet learned to be impressed by numbers the way adults were. Is it true? Caleb crouched down to his son's eye level, the way he did whenever a conversation mattered enough to require it. It's true, bud. Grandpa built something a long time ago bigger than either of us ever really talked about, and when he died it became mine. I never told you or your mom because I didn't want it to change anything about how we lived. Are we going to have to move? No. Are you going to quit the shop? Not unless I want to, Caleb said. None of that has to change unless we decide we want it to. Today's just about the court finding out the truth the same way you just did. Noah considered that for a moment with the grave, unhurried thoughtfulness he brought to most things that mattered to him. Does Mom know yet? She knows some of it, Caleb said. Today she's going to know all of it. Is she going to be mad? I don't know, Caleb admitted, because it was the truest answer he had. But whatever happens today, bud, none of it changes. What I told you a couple weeks ago. I'm not going anywhere. That part was never up for a vote, remember? Noah nodded, apparently satisfied, and padded across the kitchen to wrap his arms around Caleb's waist, in the quick, fierce hug of an 8-year-old who trusted his father completely and had never once had a reason not to. Good luck at the money court, he said, already turning back toward the cereal cabinet. The conversation closed as easily as it had opened, the way big things sometimes were for children who hadn't yet learned to carry worry the way adults did. Caleb watched him go throat tight and thought not for the first time that whatever the judge decided that afternoon, he had already gotten the only verdict that had ever actually mattered to him, dressed in the sharp gray suit she usually reserved for board presentations. Though nothing about her posture that morning carried its usual confidence. Diane Prescott walked beside her, reviewing notes on a tablet still operating as far as Lauren could tell, on the assumption that this was simply a formality, a box to check before the custody hearing proper, a chance to establish cleanly, and on the record, that Caleb Whitmore had nothing but a small business and a modest life to offer their son. Lauren knew better now, and the knowing sat in her chest like something swallowed the wrong way. You seem tense, Diane said, glancing up. I'm fine. You don't look fine. You look like a woman braced for bad news, and I promise you whatever this disclosure turns up, it's not going to change the custody math in any meaningful way. Small business owner, minor personal savings, maybe some family property. It doesn't matter, Lauren. You still have the income, the schedule flexibility once we finalize the nanny situation, the stability. This is a formality. It's not going to be small, Lauren said quietly. Diane looked at her properly, then some of the brisk confidence draining out of her expression. What do you know that I don't? I went to the airfield, the old hangar out past the county line. I talked to a man who worked for Caleb's father for 30 years. Lauren's voice was flat, controlled in the particular way that meant she was holding something down very hard. And I talked to Caleb directly. He confirmed it. There's money, Diane. A lot of it. I don't know the number, but I know it's not what either of us has been assuming. Diane's jaw tightened, the look of a lawyer recalculating an entire strategy in real time. Why didn't you tell me this 3 weeks ago? Because I didn't want it to be true, Lauren said, and because some stubborn part of me kept hoping the discovery would come back clean, and I'd never have to find out how much of my marriage I completely misunderstood. They didn't speak again until they were seated inside at the same table where Lauren had once laughed out loud at a man signing away a house he no longer needed. Caleb sat across from them beside Margaret Ellis, calm in a way that no longer read to Lauren as simplicity or contentment. It read now as something closer to certainty. A man who had known this moment was coming for a very long time and had simply been waiting patiently for it to arrive on his own terms. Judge Harmon entered, took his seat, and opened the folder in front of him without any particular ceremony, the way a man opens a folder 100 times a week. We're here for review of the financial disclosure filed in accordance with the discovery request relevant to the pending custody determination. Ms. Ellis, your client has submitted a full accounting. He has your honor. Margaret rose and handed a set of bound documents to the clerk. Then a second set to Diane Prescott, who took them with the careful guarded posture of someone bracing for a blow she already half expected. Complete records of all holdings trust structures and income sources associated with Mr. Whitmore, both personal and through the Whitmore Family Trust. Judge Harmon flipped past the cover page and began reading, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper. Lauren watched his face for a reaction and found none a professional's blankness trained through decades of never letting a courtroom read him. Diane beside her was flipping through her own copy with increasing speed, her pen no longer making notes, simply hovering over the page as though she'd forgotten what she meant to write. "Your Honor," Diane said, finally, her voice thinner than it had been all morning. "May I have a moment to review with my client? Take your time, counsel." Diane leaned toward Lauren and turned the document so she could see it tapping a line near the bottom of the second page with a finger that wasn't quite steady. "Lauren, look at this number." Lauren looked. $206 million. She read it twice, certain her eyes had misread a decimal point. Certain the figure in front of her belonged to some corporation, some public company, some world entirely separate from the man who had spent the last 11 years fixing brake pads for $40 and driving a truck with over 180,000 miles on it. But the name at the top of the page was his. Caleb Whitmore. Sole beneficiary. Whitmore Family Trust, aviation holdings, and commercial leasing operations across 4 states. Real estate portfolios, long-term investment accounts that had been compounding quietly, invisibly, for over a decade while she'd sat across from him at their kitchen table, wondering privately, resentfully, why he never seemed worried about anything. "Oh my God," Lauren said so quietly it barely carried past her own table. The courtroom had gone still. In that particular way, rooms go still when something has shifted that everyone can feel, but no one has said out loud yet. Judge Harmon closed the folder slowly and looked up first at the documents, then at Caleb sitting perfectly composed in his same faded work jacket. The same jacket he'd worn to sign away a house he clearly obviously had never needed in the first place. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, and there was something almost careful in his tone now, the tone of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the person in front of him. "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. According to this disclosure, your net worth inclusive of trust holdings exceeds $200 million. "That's correct, Your Honor. And you've held this wealth, or rather, it's been held in trust on your behalf since your father's passing approximately 8 years ago. "That's correct. During which time you have continued to operate a small auto repair business, live in a rented residence, and according to the property settlement filed with this court several weeks ago, waived claim to a marital home and joint accounts that would represent by any reasonable measure a fraction of your actual financial position." "Yes, Your Honor." Diane Prescott recovered first the way sharp lawyers always did, pulling herself back from shock through sheer professional instinct. "Your Honor, if I may, regardless of the disclosed net worth, my client's concern has always centered on demonstrated stability, not raw asset value. Mr. Whitmore's income, as reported, still derives primarily from a small auto repair business. There's no indication he intends to draw on this trust for Noah's day-to-day care education, or," counsel Judge Harmon said, not unkindly, "I'd encourage you to review page 4 of the disclosure before you finish that sentence." Diane flipped forward, and Caleb watched something in her shoulders drop as she found the line the judge was referring to, a standing education and welfare provision drafted years earlier by Margaret at Caleb's own quiet instruction, guaranteeing full coverage of Noah's schooling, medical care, and future needs, regardless of any custody outcome, funded entirely and irrevocably through the trust. "He set this up 8 years ago," Diane said, half to herself, half to Lauren beside her, "before the divorce was even a possibility." "I did," Caleb confirmed when the judge glanced his way. "Long before any of this started. Noah's needs were never something I was willing to leave uncertain whatever happened between his mother and me." Diane closed the folder without finishing her objection, and for a long moment she simply sat there, the practiced composure of a woman who built her entire career on out-arguing uncertainty, visibly searching for a thread of the argument she'd walked in with and coming up empty. Judge Harmon set his pen down and folded his hands, studying Caleb with an expression that had shifted from procedural neutrality into something closer to genuine curiosity. "Mr. Whitmore, I have been on this bench for 19 years. I have seen people hide assets from spouses from courts, from the IRS, for every reason you can imagine: greed, spite, fear of losing what they've built. I have never once seen a man hide this much money for 8 years while living like he had none of it. So I'm going to ask you directly on the record. Why?" Caleb didn't stand. He didn't reach for notes, didn't glance at Margaret for guidance. He simply answered in the same steady voice he'd used in the shop at the kitchen table on the porch 2 weeks earlier, with Lauren standing in the dark, asking him the same question in different words. "Because I wanted my son to know his father, not his father's bank account," Caleb said. "My own dad built something enormous and never let it change how he raised me. He used to say money's the easiest thing in the world to get people to respect you for, and the hardest thing to get them to respect you despite. I wanted Noah to grow up the way I did, knowing his dad shows up, knowing his dad works hard, knowing his dad tells the truth before he ever had to know what was in a bank account. I didn't want him measuring his own worth against a number. And honestly, Your Honor, I didn't want anyone measuring mine against it either. Not my wife, not my friends, not myself." Lauren sat frozen at her table, the words landing somewhere she hadn't braced for. Because underneath the shock of the number was something else entirely. A memory of every single time she'd looked at Caleb across a dinner table and quietly, privately measured him against Rebecca's husband, against her own colleagues, against some invisible scale she'd never once thought to question. And the entire time the man she'd been measuring had been sitting on more money than everyone she'd ever measured him against, combined. And he had let her do it anyway, because the alternative, being loved for what he had instead of who he was, had frightened him more than her disappointment ever could. "That's a noble answer, Mr. Whitmore," the judge said. "It's also, I'll note, directly relevant to the custody matter currently before this court, given that financial stability has been raised as a contested factor. I have the custody evaluator's report here as well. Ms. Reyes, are you present?" Patricia Reyes rose from a bench near the back of the room, folder in hand, and made her way to the front with the same unhurried composure she'd carried into Caleb's kitchen weeks earlier. "I am, Your Honor. Please summarize your findings for the record." Reyes opened her folder, though she barely glanced at it, the way a person does when they've written something so many times, revising it, that the words have simply become part of them. "I conducted separate observational visits and interviews with both parents and with the minor child Noah Whitmore, age 8, over a period of 3 weeks. My assessment focused on daily routine emotional security, parental involvement, and the child's own stated preferences and sense of stability in each household. And your conclusions?" "Noah demonstrates a strong, secure attachment to both parents," Reyes said. "He loves his mother, and he speaks about her with clear affection. However, when asked directly about consistency and predictability, knowing where he'll be, knowing who will be there, understanding the shape of his day, before it happens, Noah consistently and without prompting from either parent described his father's household as the more stable and predictable environment. I want to be precise here, Your Honor, because I know these words carry weight. He told me, quote, 'With Dad, I always know.' He was referring to whether his father would be present for meals, for homework, for bedtime. He could describe in detail small routines specific to his relationship with his father, a Friday movie tradition, a particular order for bedtime stories, an awareness of his teacher's name, his social dynamics at school, a loose tooth his father was patiently allowing him to lose in his own time. These are not details a distant parent typically possesses. In my professional opinion, Noah's sense of safety and routine is more firmly anchored in his relationship with his father than with his mother, through no failing of Mrs. Whitmore's love for her son, but simply as a matter of demonstrated day-to-day presence. Lauren felt each sentence like a small, precise blow. Not cruel, not exaggerated, simply true, in a way that left no room to argue. She thought of Ray Delgado at the hangar of the porch conversation 2 weeks earlier, Of 11 years spent building a life she'd assumed was more substantial than the one Caleb was building quietly beside her, and understood with a clarity that arrived far too late to be comfortable that she had spent all that time measuring the wrong things. "Thank you, Ms. Reyes," the judge said. He turned back to the table, looking between Lauren and Caleb, with the weary, practiced patience of a man who had delivered 1,000 rulings and understood that none of them ever felt simple from the inside. "This court will reserve formal custody determination for the scheduled hearing as procedure requires. But I want to say for the record that this disclosure changes my understanding of this case considerably, not because of the number itself, but because of what the number reveals about the character of the man who kept it hidden. Mr. Whitmore, in my experience, wealth generally reveals people. It rarely improves them. What I'm seeing today is a man who had every opportunity to use $200 million to win an argument, humiliate an ex-wife, or buy his way into an easier life, and chose repeatedly not to. That matters to this court." Diane Prescott sat very still beside Lauren. Her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the quiet recalibration of a lawyer whose entire argument had just been dismantled by a single line of testimony and a stack of financial records. She didn't look at Lauren. She simply closed her folder and set it down on the table, the gesture of a woman who already understood, even before the judge formally recessed the hearing, which direction the wind had shifted. Lauren didn't hear the judge dismiss the session. She was still staring at the number on the page in front of her, and then at Caleb sitting 3 feet away in his same worn jacket, looking not triumphant, not vindicated, not even particularly relieved, just tired. The specific tiredness of a man who had been carrying something enormous and alone for 8 long years and had finally set it down. Near the back of the courtroom, in a seat close enough to the exit, that no one had thought to question why a stranger in an expensive suit was sitting in on a family court proceeding. Victor Hale closed his own copy of the public filing, obtained as court records so often were through channels that required neither permission nor apology, and allowed himself a small, humorless smile. $206 million confirmed on the record, no longer a rumor he could trade quietly for leverage, no longer a secret he could dangle in front of journalists for a price. The number was public now. His window had closed the exact moment the judge finished reading it aloud. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit without looking at Caleb, without looking at anyone already dialing a different number on his phone, before he'd even reached the hallway, already moving on to whatever opportunity came next, the way men like him always did. Caleb didn't watch him go. He wasn't thinking about Victor Hale at all. He was thinking about a kitchen table years ago and a 12-year-old boy who hadn't understood yet why his father refused to buy a nicer car, and a promise he'd made to himself the day Margaret Ellis first slid that folder across a conference room table. That whatever this money turned out to mean for his life, it would never mean more than the small, ordinary hours he spent with his son. He gathered his own folder, nodded once to Margaret, and rose from the table, and for the first time since the hearing began, he allowed himself to look directly at Lauren. She was still staring at him like she was seeing him, actually seeing him, for the very first time in 11 years. Lauren didn't move from her seat until the courtroom had nearly emptied, and by the time she found her feet, Caleb was already in the hallway, outside Margaret Ellis a few steps ahead of him, speaking quietly into her phone. Lauren caught up to him near the water fountain, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them different now than it had been an hour earlier, not hostile, not performed, just heavy with everything that had just changed. "Caleb," he turned. He didn't look defensive, didn't look braced for another round of the conversation they'd had on his porch 2 weeks earlier. He just looked tired, and something in that tiredness made Lauren's chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't really know what to say to you right now," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything." "I do, actually." She stepped closer, glancing once at Diane Prescott, who was gathering her things a few feet away, and pointedly not looking in their direction, giving them what privacy a courthouse hallway could offer. "I've been sitting in there running through 11 years like a highlight reel, and every single memory I keep landing on makes me feel sick, Caleb. The old truck. The way I used to wince a little when you told people what you did for a living, like I needed a second to brace myself before I could be proud of you out loud." The weekends you spent with Noah while I was at the office telling myself I was building something for our family, when really, I think I was just building something for me. Lauren, let me finish, please. Her voice cracked slightly and she pressed on before it could fully break. I judged you. For years. Quietly in ways I told myself weren't cruel, because I never said them out loud, but they were there every single day sitting underneath everything. I valued what Rebecca's husband had, what my colleagues had. I valued success the way my mother taught me to measure it, and I decided somewhere along the way that you'd failed at it, and I let that decision poison how I saw you, how I talked about you, how I treated you. And the entire time, Caleb, you had more than any of them. You just never needed anyone to know it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that held no satisfaction in it at all. None of the vindication she almost felt like she deserved to see. I wasn't trying to prove anything to you by hiding it, he said finally. I want you to understand that. It was never a test. I know that now. I don't think I understood it then. Lauren wrapped her arms around herself, the same instinctive gesture from the porch, like she was holding something in that wanted to come apart. I thought you were failing because you weren't becoming like me, like the people I worked with. I thought ambition looked one specific way, and you didn't fit it, so I decided you'd settled, given up. And the whole time you were just building something different, something I never bothered to actually look at. I wasn't trying to become successful, Caleb said quietly. I was trying to become someone my son could be proud of. Those aren't the same thing, Lauren. I used to think they might be when I was younger. My dad taught me they're not. Lauren's eyes filled, and she didn't bother wiping at them, standing there in the fluorescent light of a courthouse hallway, looking at a man she realized with a clarity that felt almost violent in how suddenly it had arrived, she had spent over a decade failing to actually see. I don't want your money, Caleb. I need you to know that. I'm not saying any of this because $200 million changes how I feel about you. If anything, it makes it worse. Because it means I was wrong about you for reasons that had nothing to do with what you had, and everything to do with who you were, and I missed it anyway. I believe you, Caleb said, and he meant it. Whatever else had broken between them, he had never once doubted that Lauren's ambition came from somewhere real, even when it curdled into something that hurt him. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person, Lauren. I think you grew up being told success looked a certain way, and you built your whole life chasing that picture, and somewhere along the way, you forgot to ask whether it was the only picture worth chasing. That's not evil. It's just narrow. And narrow things can widen if you let them. Is that forgiveness? It's honesty, Caleb said. Forgiveness is something I'm still working on. I'm not going to pretend 11 years of feeling small in my own marriage disappears because you apologized in a hallway. But I don't want to spend whatever's left of this, the co-parenting, the next 15 years of birthdays and graduations, carrying resentment around, like it's doing either of us any good. Noah doesn't need parents who hate each other. He needs parents who can sit in the same room without it costing him something. Lauren nodded, wiping finally at her eyes with the back of her hand. An unguarded gesture that Caleb hadn't seen from her in years, not since before the promotions and the corner office, and the version of herself she'd built to survive rooms that measured people the way she'd once measured him. I want to be better, she said. Not for the case. Not because a judge is watching or because Patricia Reyes wrote a report that made me sound like the parent who shows up late. For Noah. I want to actually be the mother he described to her, the one he trusts, the one who's there. I don't know exactly how to do that yet, but I want to try. Then try, Caleb said simply. That's all any of this was ever going to take. They didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment, not yet, maybe not for a long time. But Lauren extended her hand, and Caleb shook it, and something about the formality of the gesture felt more honest than an embrace would have two people who had loved each other imperfectly, hurt each other in ways both large and small, standing in a courthouse hallway, agreeing without needing to say it out loud, to try building something new out of what was left. The weeks that followed moved faster than either of them expected. The formal custody hearing, scheduled for a month out, arrived with almost none of the tension that had defined the property settlement or the financial disclosure. Diane Prescott, to her credit, had recalibrated her entire approach, Once Lauren made clear she wasn't interested in fighting for an outcome that didn't serve Noah, and by the time the hearing actually convened, both attorneys had already negotiated the framework of an agreement neither side intended to contest. Primary residential custody to Mr. Whitmore. Judge Harmon read, glancing over his glasses at both parents seated calmly at their respective tables, with equal decision-making authority for both parents on matters of health education and welfare, and a scheduled parenting plan providing Mrs. Whitmore with substantial and consistent time, including alternating weekends, holidays, and no less than one weekday evening per week, subject to revision as circumstances evolve. Both parties have indicated agreement with these terms. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Margaret said. Yes, Your Honor, Diane echoed, and beside her, Lauren nodded. No argument in her posture at all. None of the fight she'd walked in with 3 months earlier, believing this outcome would never be acceptable to her. I'll note for the record, the judge added, setting down his pen, that this is one of the more collaborative resolutions I've seen cross this bench in some time, particularly given how contentious the early stages of this case appeared. Whatever's changed between the two of you, I'd encourage you to hold on to it. Children notice more than we give them credit for, and they remember longer than we'd like. Outside in the same hallway where they'd stood weeks earlier, Lauren turned to Caleb with something that looked almost like relief. That's it. It's actually that simple now. It was never supposed to be complicated, Caleb said. We just made it that way for a while. Lauren's phone buzzed in her bag, and out of habit she reached for it before catching herself and letting it go. Unanswered, a small gesture that Caleb noticed and didn't comment on, though something in his expression softened slightly at the sight of it. I turned down a project last week, Lauren said almost sheepishly, like she wasn't quite sure why she was telling him. A big one. The kind I would have killed for 2 years ago. It would have meant 3 weeks of travel next month right during Noah's school play. She shrugged, the gesture small and a little uncertain, like she was still getting used to the shape of her own new priorities. I told my director someone else could take it. First time in 6 years I've said no to something like that. How'd that feel? Terrifying, Lauren admitted. And then, weirdly kind of wonderful. I watched Noah rehearse his 3 lines for that play like it was the most important thing that's ever happened to him, and I just sat there in a folding chair in a school gymnasium thinking this is what I was missing. Not the show, just being the one who was there for it. Caleb smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in longer than she could remember. Not guarded, not tired, just genuinely warm. Noah's been talking about that play for 2 weeks. He's convinced Farmer Number 2 is a bigger part than anyone realizes. It absolutely is, Lauren said, and for a moment standing there in the hallway, they both laughed, a small, ordinary, unremarkable thing. The kind of laugh 2 people share about their child without any weight or history behind it, and it felt to both of them like the first genuinely easy moment they'd had together in years. The night of the play, Caleb arrived early to save seats, and he was still setting his jacket over the folding chair beside him when he spotted Lauren coming down the gymnasium aisle, in jeans and a cardigan, no blazer, no phone visible in her hand at all, scanning the rows until she found him. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, a little uncertain, like she wasn't sure whether the easy hallway conversation from weeks earlier had actually changed anything, or if she was about to find out it hadn't. "It's yours," Caleb said, and meant it. She sat smoothing her hands over her knees, glancing around the gymnasium at the rows of folding chairs and the paper and cardboard farm scenery propped against the far wall. "I haven't been to one of these since kindergarten. I keep thinking I should know how this works, and I genuinely don't. You sit, you clap too loud when he comes on, and you pretend not to notice when Farmer Number 2 forgets his line and just stands there blinking at the audience for a solid 5 seconds. That's oddly specific." "He does it every time we rehearse the second scene at home," Caleb admitted. "I've made peace with it." When the lights dimmed and the second-grade cast shuffled onto the makeshift stage, Lauren found herself leaning forward without meaning to, watching for her son with an intensity she hadn't expected from herself. And when Noah appeared, overalls, too big, a straw hat, slightly crooked, and delivered his 3 lines clearly without forgetting a single word. This time she felt something in her chest swell in a way that no boardroom victory, no promotion, no closed deal had ever quite managed to produce. "He did it," she whispered, gripping Caleb's arm without thinking, and he glanced at her surprised before letting himself smile. "He did it," Caleb agreed. Afterward, in the crush of parents and half-costumed children in the gymnasium lobby, Noah spotted them both together and ran the last few steps. Straw hat askew, cheeks flushed with the particular pride of a child who has just done something hard in front of an audience and survived it. "Did you see I didn't forget it this time? You were the best farmer I've ever seen," Lauren said, crouching down to his level, and there was nothing performed in it. None of the careful correctness she sometimes brought to moments like this in the past. It was simple and immediate. The kind of praise that came from actually watching, actually caring, actually being present in a folding chair for 45 minutes instead of checking a phone under the table. "Mom, you came," Noah said, and something in the way he said it, a small note of genuine surprise buried under the joy, landed on Lauren harder than she expected it to. "I wouldn't have missed it," she said, and pulled him into a hug, and over her son's shoulder she caught Caleb's eye, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. It was in its own small and unremarkable way, exactly the kind of moment Noah had once described to Patricia Reyes, without either parent ever realizing he'd been quietly measuring both of their lives against it the whole time. At home that evening, Caleb sat across from Margaret at his kitchen table, a stack of folders between them that had nothing to do with custody arrangements or financial disclosures. Noah was upstairs supposedly doing homework, though the sound of a video game occasionally leaking through the floorboards suggested his attention had wandered. "You wanted to talk about the trust," Margaret said. "Now that it's public, now that the custody matter's settled, I assume you're thinking about what comes next." "I've been thinking about it for years, actually," Caleb said. "I just never had a reason to act on it while I was trying to keep the whole thing quiet. Now that it's out, I don't see the point in going back to pretending. I want to do something with it. Something real." "Define real." Caleb leaned back in his chair, turning a pen over in his hands, the way he used to turn over a torque wrench, thinking through a problem methodically before committing to the fix. "My whole life, people have made assumptions about what someone like me could or couldn't do based on what they saw on the surface. A mechanic, a single dad, someone without a fancy degree or a corner office. And for years I let people believe those assumptions because it was easier than explaining the truth. But I keep thinking about all the people out there who really are what I was pretending to be, genuinely struggling, genuinely stretched thin, doing everything right and still one bad month away from losing everything. I had a $200 million safety net the whole time and never had to use it. Most people don't get that luxury." "You want to build a foundation," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "I want to build something that helps single parents keep their kids in stable housing when a job falls through. Something that helps skilled workers, mechanics, electricians, people who work with their hands get access to the kind of capital that usually only goes to people with the right last name or the right degree. Something for kids from families like the one I grew up worried I might have if my dad hadn't built what he built. I don't want a building with my name on it, Margaret. I want something that actually moves the needle for people who remind me of who I used to be before anyone knew what was in my bank account." Margaret studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression carried the particular pride of a woman who had watched this man grow from a grieving 26-year-old staring at an impossible number into someone who finally understood exactly what to do with it. "Your father would have liked that," she said quietly. "He used to say the same thing actually near the end, that he'd built all of this and never quite figured out what it was supposed to be for beyond keeping you comfortable. I think he'd have been glad to see you figure out the rest of it." "Then let's figure it out properly," Caleb said. "I want it operational within 6 months. Scholarships for trade school, emergency housing grants for single-parent households, small business loans for people who'd never qualify through a normal bank because their collateral doesn't look like collateral to anyone who's never actually worked with their hands. That's going to take real structure, staff, a board, This isn't something you run out of the back office of a mechanic shop. I know, Caleb said. I'm not trying to run it myself day to day. I want to be involved. I want to have a say in who it helps and how. But I've got a son who needs breakfast made and homework checked and bedtime stories read in the right order. And none of that changes just because there's a foundation with my name loosely attached to it somewhere. Find me good people to run it. I'll show up for the parts that matter. Margaret smiled, closing the folder in front of her. You really are exactly like him. Good, Caleb said. I've decided that's not an insult anymore. Upstairs, the video game sounds had finally stopped, and a few minutes later, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks, hair sticking up on one side, looking between his father and Margaret, with the particular curiosity of a child who had learned over the last several months that important conversations tended to happen at this table. Are you guys talking about the money thing again? We are, Caleb said. Come here a second. I want to ask you something. Noah shuffled over and climbed into the chair beside his father, and Caleb turned to face him fully the way he did whenever a conversation mattered enough to require his full attention. I'm going to use some of Grandpa's money to help people, Caleb said. Families that are having a hard time. Parents who are working really hard but still struggling to make ends meet. Kids who might not get a fair shot otherwise. What do you think about that? Noah considered it with the grave seriousness he brought to most decisions that felt big to him. Like Mr. Delgado? He said his daughter can't afford the trade school she wants to go to. He was talking about it at the shop last week. Caleb glanced at Margaret, something flickering across his face. Yeah, exactly like that. Then I think it's a good idea, Noah said with the simple, unclouded certainty that only children seemed able to access anymore. You always say the shop's not just about fixing cars, it's about helping people who are stuck. This is just a bigger version of that, right? That's exactly right, Caleb said, and something in his chest loosened at hearing his own philosophy handed back to him in an 8-year-old's plain language stripped of every complication the adults in his life had layered onto it. That's exactly what it is. Can I help name it? What did you have in mind? Noah thought about it for a moment, swinging his sock feet against the chair legs. Grandpa's garage, he said finally. Because it's still kind of like fixing things, just people instead of cars. Margaret laughed, quiet and genuine, and Caleb felt something in his throat tighten in the particular way it always did when his son said something that landed somewhere deeper than he probably realized. Grandpa's garage. Caleb repeated slowly, testing the shape of it. I think that's perfect, bud. Word of the foundation spread through town faster than Caleb expected, though not in the way he'd braced for. He'd worried in the quiet weeks after the disclosure became public record that his customers might start treating him differently. Deferential, awkward. Unsure how to talk to a mechanic worth $200 million. Instead, most of them simply kept bringing their cars in the way they always had, though a few couldn't resist a comment. You could have told us, you know, said Frank Delgado Ray's son, and one of Caleb's oldest customers standing at the counter while Caleb finished writing up an estimate. Would have saved me some grief last winter when I was apologizing for being 3 weeks late on my bill. Wouldn't have changed the bill, Caleb said, sliding the estimate across the counter. Still $40 for the sensor, same as it's always been. That's the thing about you, Whitmore. You're either the most honest man in this town or the best liar I've ever met, and I genuinely can't tell which. Bit of both, probably, Caleb admitted. I never lied about who I was, Frank. I just didn't lead with what I had. There's a difference. Frank considered that nodding slowly, the kind of nod that meant a man was filing something away to think about later. Heard about the foundation. My girl Amy's been trying to get into that diesel mechanics program over in Fairview for 2 years now. Tuition's been the whole holdup. Have her fill out an application when it opens next month, Caleb said. No promises on my end. It's going to be run properly with a real review process, not me just handing out favors to people I like. But if she qualifies same as anyone else. That's more than fair, Frank said, and something in his voice carried a gratitude he didn't quite know how to phrase any other way. Your dad would be proud of you, you know. I only met him a handful of times, but even back then folks used to say Walter Whitmore was the kind of rich that didn't need anybody to know it. He always said the same thing about being poor, Caleb said. Didn't need anybody to know that either, just needed to make sure the people who mattered to him never had to wonder. Frank left with his estimate and a promise to send Amy's application in, and Caleb stood behind the counter for a moment after the door closed, looking out at the same bay where he'd spent nearly 2 decades of his life. The same lifts, the same tools, the same faint smell of motor oil that had never once made him feel like less of a man for choosing it, even now, even with $200 million sitting quietly in a trust he barely thought about most days. That evening, driving home with Noah beside him, windows cracked, radio playing low. Caleb felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been there in a very long time. Not relief exactly, and not triumph. Something steadier than either. Something closer to peace. "Dad," Noah said, watching the streetlights pass. "Are things going to be different now because of the money and everything?" Caleb thought about the question for longer than it probably needed, turning it over the way he turned over every question that mattered. "Some things," he said finally. "We'll probably do a few things we couldn't before. Help some people who need it. But the important stuff, me Friday movie nights, dinner at 6 unless the shop runs late, none of that's changing. That was never up for negotiation, bud. Not for $200 million, not for $200 billion. Noah seemed satisfied with that, settling back against the seat with the easy trust of a child who had never once in his whole life had a reason to doubt his father's word. "Good," he said, already turning to look out the window at the passing houses. "Can we get the good cereal this weekend? Not the boring kind Mom buys?" Caleb laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in months. "We'll get the good cereal," he said. "Some things are non-negotiable too, bud." 6 months moved the way Caleb had always privately hoped they would. Once the dust finally settled, quietly, mostly filled with the same small ordinary hours that had defined his life long before anyone knew what was sitting in his trust account. But quiet, he was learning, didn't mean invisible, not anymore. And there were mornings that reminded him of exactly how much had changed, even while the important things stayed exactly the same. Grandpa's garage opened its doors figuratively, since it operated out of a modest office suite above a bakery downtown, rather than an actual garage. A detail Noah found endlessly personally offended by, with a staff of 6 aboard that included Margaret Ellis as chair and a mission statement. Caleb had insisted on writing himself over Margaret's gentle objection that professional grant writers existed for exactly this purpose. "People don't need to read something polished," Caleb had told her. "They need to read something true." The first round of grants went out 11 weeks after the doors opened, and the first name on the list belonged to a 19-year-old named Amy Delgado, who showed up at Caleb's shop on a Saturday afternoon, still holding the acceptance letter like she wasn't entirely convinced it was real. "I got in," she said, breathless, before Caleb had even fully turned around from the car he was working on. "The diesel program. Full tuition plus the housing stipend for the first year. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to say thank you for something like this." "You don't have to," Caleb said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "You earned the spot. The application process was blind. The review committee didn't know your name or your father's name until after they made the decision. That was the whole point. My dad's gonna lose his mind when I tell him." Amy laughed, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "He still feels weird about it, about you. He keeps saying he doesn't know how to talk to I don't even know what he calls you, a local celebrity maybe." "Tell him I'm still the same guy who charged him $40 for a sensor last winter," Caleb said. Nothing about that part changed. Amy left with her father's old truck running smoother than it had in years, at no charge, because Caleb had quietly slipped it onto the shop's schedule between 2 paying jobs. And Frank Delgado never did figure out why his brake pads had been replaced for free, though he had his suspicions. The reporters came a few weeks after that, slower than Caleb expected. Though once they arrived with a persistence he hadn't quite prepared for. A regional business paper ran the first piece, "The Quiet Millionaire Mechanic." The headline read, Above a photograph some enterprising young reporter had taken of Caleb bent over an open hood, completely unaware his picture was being made. And within a month, the story had traveled further than anyone in Caleb's orbit had expected, a small-town divorce case to travel. A producer from a national morning show called Margaret's office 3 times in a single week, requesting an interview offering at one point an amount of money for exclusive access to the family's story that made even Margaret raise an eyebrow. "You don't have to do any of this," she told Caleb, relaying the offer over coffee at his kitchen table. Noah's backpack still slung over one of the chairs from the morning rush. "You've got no legal obligation, no financial need, and frankly no personal need either. You could simply decline every request that comes in and let this become old news in a few months, the way most stories eventually do." "I know," Caleb said. "But I keep thinking about Amy. About the next Amy and the one after that who might never hear about the foundation. If it stays some quiet local thing nobody outside the county knows exists. If a few interviews mean more people find out, there's real help available, real no strings, no favoritism, then I'll sit in front of a camera and answer some questions I'd rather not answer. Doesn't have to change who I am when the camera's off." He did exactly one interview chosen carefully with a local news anchor named Diane Kowalski, who Margaret vetted personally, and Caleb sat in his own shop in his own coveralls and answered questions about the fortune, the divorce, the custody case, and the foundation with the same plain, unhurried honesty he brought to explaining a repair estimate. A lot of people watching this are going to wonder, Kowalski said near the end of the interview, why a man worth over $200 million is still fixing transmissions on a Tuesday afternoon instead of, well, she gestured vaguely at the world beyond the shop's open bay door, living the life that kind of money usually buys. Caleb considered the question for a moment before answering the way he considered most things that actually mattered. "Because this is the life I chose before I ever knew what was in that trust account," he said. "My dad taught me that money's supposed to give you more freedom to be who you already are, not turn you into somebody else. I already knew who I was. I was a mechanic who loved his son and liked working with his hands. $200 million didn't change either one of those things. It just meant I could help a few more people along the way." The clip ran on 3 different national outlets within the week, and for a strange, disorienting stretch of about a month. Caleb Whitmore became against every instinct he had. Something like famous a name, people recognized at the hardware store, a face strangers occasionally asked to photograph a story. Parents apparently told their kids about at dinner tables in towns Caleb had never even visited. The offers came next, the way Margaret had warned him they would. Investment firms wanting to manage his holdings more aggressively. A national auto repair chain offering to buy his shop outright and put his name on 12 locations across the state. A man in an expensive suit, not Victor Hale, though Caleb noted the resemblance in the pitch itself, the same practiced warmth wrapped around the same hunger for a piece of something he hadn't built. Who showed up unannounced one afternoon with a proposal to turn Grandpa's Garage into a scalable national brand, with Caleb's face on the marketing materials. "Think about the reach," the man said, spreading glossy mock-ups across the same counter where Caleb wrote up brake jobs and oil changes. "Franchise the foundation model. Grandpa's Garage locations in every state. You become the face of working-class philanthropy in this country. We're talking 8 figures in additional funding within 18 months easily." Caleb looked over the mock-ups for a long moment, his own face staring back at him from a dozen different taglines, none of which sounded like anything he'd actually say. "How much of that funding goes directly to families?" he asked. "After marketing, after your management fee, after however many executives this scalable brand needs to run it?" The man hesitated, just slightly recalculating. "There'd be overhead, of course, but—" "That's my answer then," Caleb said, sliding the mock-ups back across the counter. "I didn't build this to put my face on anything. I built it because a 19-year-old girl I've known since she was 6 years old needed help paying for diesel school, and there wasn't anybody else stepping up to give it to her. I'm not interested in scaling that into a brand. I'm interested in keeping it small enough that every single dollar actually reaches somebody like Amy. You're leaving a lot of impact on the table, Mr. Whitmore. A lot of families you could reach." "Maybe," Caleb said. Or maybe I just help the families in front of me and trust that's enough. My dad ran an empire, and nobody outside a handful of business partners ever knew his name. I don't need mine on a highway billboard to know the work's real." The man left without his mock-ups, and Frank Delgado, who'd been waiting his turn at the counter the whole time, pretending not to listen, gave a low whistle once the door swung shut behind him. "You just turned down 8 figures, Frank said. "I turned down a stranger who wanted to put a price tag on something that was never supposed to have one," Caleb said, already reaching for the next work order. "There's a difference, Frank. There's always a difference." Caleb never heard from Victor Hale again after that day in the courtroom. Margaret mentioned months later hearing secondhand that Hale had turned up in some other county, chasing some other quiet fortune. Some other family with more money than anyone around them realized the way men like him always did. Moving on, the moment a door closed, already knocking on the next one, before the sound had finished echoing. Caleb didn't think about him often. There wasn't much room left in his life for a man who'd only ever seen a number where everyone else had eventually learned to see a father. He handled every offer that followed the same way, one after another, politely, firmly, without a hint of temptation in any of it. He kept the shop open 6 days a week. He kept doing homework at the kitchen table every evening except Friday. He kept driving the same truck now well past 200,000 miles, despite at least 4 separate strangers offering unprompted to buy him a replacement. Lauren watched all of it unfold from a careful, respectful distance, showing up for her scheduled time with Noah with a consistency that had over the months stopped feeling like an effort and started feeling simply like who she was becoming. She'd left the firm eventually, not dramatically, not in some sweeping act of reinvention, just a quiet transition to a smaller regional company with better hours and a manageable travel schedule. A decision she mentioned to Caleb almost offhandedly. One evening during a pickup, like it wasn't the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable to her a year earlier. "Diane thought I was insane," Lauren admitted, standing in Caleb's driveway while Noah gathered his things from the back seat of her car. Turning down a VP track for a job with a shorter commute and no travel. She kept asking what I was actually trying to prove. What did you tell her? That I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. That felt like the whole point. Lauren watched Noah struggle with his backpack zipper for a moment before crouching down to help him, an automatic, unthinking gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine from her a year earlier, back when every gesture toward her son had felt even to her slightly rehearsed. "I used to think slowing down meant falling behind. I don't know when exactly that stopped being true. Maybe around the time I watched a judge read out your net worth and realized the man everyone assumed had failed had actually been the only one of us who understood what mattered the whole time." "You weren't a failure either, Lauren," Caleb said. "You were just running toward the wrong finish line. That's a different thing." She smiled at that, small and genuine, and it no longer carried the particular ache it used to carry whenever the two of them found an easy moment together. It just felt increasingly like two people who had once loved each other imperfectly, finding a new, steadier way to care about the same small boy for the rest of both their lives. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nearly a year after the divorce had first been finalized, that Noah asked the question that would end up staying with Caleb longer than almost anything else from that entire chapter of his life. They were in the kitchen, Caleb stirring a pot of the same spaghetti recipe he'd been making since Noah was old enough to eat solid food. Noah perched on a stool at the counter, swinging his feet, working through a word search from the back of a cereal box. "Dad," Noah said, not looking up from the puzzle. "Are we rich?" Caleb turned the burner down and considered the question properly, the way he'd learned over the last year to consider every question his son asked him, no matter how small it seemed on the surface. "What makes you ask that, bud?" Tyler at school said his dad said we're like mega rich, like private jet rich. Is that true? "We have money." "Yeah," Caleb said. "More than most families ever will. That part's true." Noah set down his pencil, turning the question over with the same grave seriousness he brought to most things that mattered to him. "So are we rich?" Caleb wiped his hands on the dish towel slung over his shoulder and came around the counter to sit on the stool beside his son, the way he did whenever a conversation deserved his full attention instead of half of it over a stove. "We're lucky," Caleb said. Noah frowned, working the distinction over. "What's the difference? Being rich means having things," Caleb said. "Money houses whatever you want to buy whenever you want to buy it. That's real, and it matters some, but it's not really the important part. Being lucky means having people who love you. It means having a mom who shows up to every single one of your school plays now and calls just to hear about your day, even on the nights you're not with her. It means having friends like Marcus, who still like you the exact same way, whether your dad's on the news or not. It means having a dad who gets to make you spaghetti on a Tuesday and doesn't have to be anywhere else in the whole world while he's doing it." Caleb reached over and ruffled his son's hair, the same gesture he'd used since Noah was small enough to fit against his shoulder. "That's the lucky part, bud. The money's just money. It comes and goes, and plenty of people have a whole lot of it and still feel like they've got nothing at all. I've seen that up close. I'd rather have what we've got." Noah considered this with the particular seriousness only children seem able to summon for questions that actually matter, turning it over slowly, testing its edges, the way he tested everything before he let himself believe it. "So we're lucky and rich," he said finally, like he'd found a loophole. Caleb laughed, surprised the sound warm and unguarded in the quiet kitchen. "Yeah, bud, I suppose we're both." "Good," Noah said, satisfied, already turning back to his word search like the matter had been settled to his complete approval, the way only an 8-year-old 9. Now his birthday having come and gone quietly. The month before celebrated with the same small backyard gathering they'd always had. No different for the money, sitting untouched in a trust somewhere, could move so effortlessly from an enormous question to a cereal box puzzle in the space of a single breath. Years passed, the way years do faster in memory than they ever feel while they're happening, and the story of Caleb Whitmore settled slowly into something closer to local legend than daily headline. The mechanic who turned out to be worth a fortune. The father who never once let it change him. The foundation that quietly kept sending kids like Amy Delgado to trade schools and kept keeping struggling families in their homes, one grant at a time, year after year, long after the reporters had moved on to some newer, shinier story. He never did buy a nicer truck. He drove the old one until it finally gave out for good somewhere past 230,000 miles. And when Margaret gently suggested he might at long last allow himself something with fewer than 4 previous owners, he bought another truck almost identical to the first, because it did the job, because it fit in his life the way it always had. Because some things he'd decided a very long time ago were never actually about what a man could afford. Noah grew up the way children do, when at least one parent shows up for every single ordinary hour of it, steady, secure, unbothered by a bank account he rarely thought about because his father had never once let it define the shape of his childhood. He grew up knowing his mother's love in its own evolving, increasingly present way, and his father's love in the way he'd always known it, patient and constant and entirely without condition. And somewhere in the space between those two kinds of love, he grew into exactly the kind of person both of his parents, in their own separate and imperfect ways, had hoped he might become. And Caleb kept working, kept fixing what was broken, one car and one family at a time, one grant application and one bedtime story at a time, never once needing anyone to know the size of what he carried, because he had already learned decades earlier at a kitchen table across from a father who understood the same quiet truth that the real measure of a man was never going to be found in a number. It was going to be found always in what he chose to give away, and in the son who grew up knowing, without a single doubt, exactly who his father really was. That was the fortune Caleb Whitmore actually left behind. Not the $200 million sitting quietly in a trust, and not the foundation with his father's name folded into it. It was a boy who would spend the rest of his own life measuring people the way his father had taught him to, not by what they owned, but by what they gave, and not by how loudly they announced their worth, but by how quietly they lived it. And that in the end was worth more than any number a courtroom could ever put on a page.